Story 1, The Lone Camper, a night that changed everything. The woods are quiet, save for the faint rustling of leaves in the gentle summer breeze. But silence in the wilderness isn't always peaceful, it can be ominous. A reminder of how small we are compared to the vast unknown. Tonight, we bring you a tale that might make you reconsider your next camping trip. If you enjoy chilling stories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Wolf Tells. And now, let's dive into the story of two friends, a remote campsite, and a shadow in the dark that defies explanation. In the summer of 2016, my friend Matt and I were stuck in a rut, living in a quiet, remote town surrounded by endless forest. There wasn't much to do except go hiking, camping, or make the long drive to the next town over. That summer, camping had become our go-to escape from the monotony. When Matt suggested we try out a spot recommended by one of his friends, I was all in. He described it as secluded, scenic, and only a short drive from town. The perfect place to unwind for a night or two. The drive took us to the outskirts of town, where paved roads turned to gravel and eventually into a barely there dirt path. There was no parking area, just enough room to pull over and leave the car safely off to the side. The trail leading to the campsite was narrow and overgrown, but it was clear enough to follow. We hiked for about an hour before we arrived. It was supposed to be a hilltop overlooking a lake, but reality fell short of expectations. Instead of a pristine lake, we found a swampy, algae-covered pond. Its dark green water shimmered under the dappled sunlight, surrounded by dense trees that seemed to crowd the area. Matt laughed nervously. "Some lake? Huh. Maybe it's better in the spring," I offered, dropping my pack and surveying the area. But the uneasy feeling in my gut had nothing to do with the swamp. "Hey," Matt said, nudging me. "Look over there." Across the pond, partially hidden by the trees, was a single tent. Its faded, weather-worn fabric suggested it had been there for a while. "Think someone's camping here?" he asked. "Could be," I replied, though something about the tent unsettled me. Then I saw it. A figure standing near the edge of the water, directly across from us. They were too far away to see clearly, but their presence was unmistakable. I waved. A quick, friendly gesture meant to break the tension. The figure didn't respond. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching. We decided to set up our tents on the hill, where the ground was drier and firmer. The rest of the day was uneventful, but that feeling of unease lingered. Every so often, one of us would glance toward the pond, half expecting to see the figure again. But the person, if they were a person, never appeared near the tent. As the afternoon turned to evening, we convinced ourselves they had probably left. Probably just some hiker passing through, Matt said, though his tone wasn't convincing. "Yeah," I agreed, though the image of the figure standing motionless at the water's edge was burned into my mind. We built a fire as the sun set, its crackling flames a welcome distraction. Dinner was simple: canned beans and some roasted hot dogs. The night was calm, save for the occasional hoot of an owl or the distant rustle of leaves. But that calm shattered when Matt froze mid-bite. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "See what?" He pointed past the fire, his hand trembling slightly. "Over there, by the trees." I turned slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. At first, I saw nothing but shadows. Then, just beyond the edge of the firelight, I spotted it, a figure standing in the darkness. No more than 20 feet away. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The figure didn't respond. They didn't move. They just stood there, their features obscured by the shadows. "Hey!" Matt shouted, his voice louder now, laced with a mix of fear and anger. The figure turned abruptly and disappeared into the trees. The forest fell eerily silent after that. No insects chirped. No leaves rustled. It was as if the woods were holding their breath. "We should leave," Matt said, his voice shaking. "It's too dark," I replied, though I was just as scared. "We'll get lost." We spent the next hour huddled by the fire, straining to hear any sound, any sign that the figure might return. At some point, exhaustion overtook us, and we retreated to our tents. Sleep didn't come easy, and I must have dozed off only briefly because I woke to Matt shaking me violently. "Someone's outside your tent," he whispered urgently. I froze, straining to listen. The faint crunch of footsteps on dry leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. "Don't move," Matt said. But I couldn't stay still. Slowly, I unzipped my tent just enough to peek outside. Standing mere feet away was the figure. Their clothes were dark and tattered, their hair long and wild. They tilted their head slightly, as if studying me. "Get out of here," Matt shouted, his voice breaking the silence. The figure didn't flinch. For a moment, they stood there, unmoving. Then, as silently as they had come, they turned and disappeared into the darkness. We didn't sleep after that. Every rustle of leaves, every whisper of wind sent our hearts racing. We rebuilt the fire, its light a small comfort against the oppressive darkness. By the time the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, we were packed and ready to leave. The hike back to the car felt endless, every step shadowed by the fear of being watched. When we reached town, we went straight to the police. At first, they seemed skeptical, but their expressions changed when we mentioned the tent across the pond. "That tent belongs to a missing person," one of the officers said. "They've been gone for over a month." A search of the area revealed no new leads. But when they showed us a photo of the missing person, both Matt and I knew the figure we saw wasn't them. So who was it? And what did they want? Sometimes, the scariest thing about the woods isn't the wildlife, it's the people you might find there. But what happens when danger follows you home? Our next story takes us out of the forest and into a seemingly safe backyard, where the shadows hide more than meets the eye. Story 2, Stalked at Home Base, a tale too close to home. There's a certain kind of tranquility that comes from being alone in nature. But when the stillness is interrupted, when peace turns to dread, it's something you never forget. Tonight, we unravel the story of a man who sought solace in his own backyard, only to realize he wasn't alone. If you're new to Wolf Tells, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales of terror that will keep you up at night. And now, let's dive into a story that will make you think twice about what, or who, might be lurking just outside your door. Growing up in the suburbs, I always dreamed of having a home surrounded by nature. When I finally bought my house, nestled on a few acres of forested land, it felt like a dream come true. The property wasn't enormous, but it was private, with no neighbors in sight. I often joked that it was the perfect place to disappear from the world. One crisp evening in early fall, I decided to spend the night camping on my land. It was something I did occasionally to clear my head and enjoy the quiet. The leaves had started to turn, creating a stunning tapestry of red, orange, and gold. The air was cool but pleasant, and the sky was a deep, endless blue as the sun began its descent. By 4 p.m., I had everything packed and ready. My campsite was about a 15-minute walk from the house, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. It wasn't much, a fire pit I'd built a few years ago, a flat area for my tent, and a folding chair I kept stashed under a tarp. As I set up my tent and gathered wood for the fire, I noticed something unusual. About 100 yards away, through the gaps in the trees, I saw someone walking. They weren't heading toward me, but their presence was strange. My property was bordered by other private land, and there weren't any public trails nearby. Whoever they were, they had to have trespassed to get there. I paused, watching them for a moment. They didn't have any visible gear, no backpack, no rifle. Nothing that might suggest they were a hunter or hiker. Just a person, walking slowly, almost aimlessly. Probably a neighbor, I muttered, though the explanation didn't quite sit right. By the time they disappeared into the trees, I had convinced myself it was nothing to worry about. After all, this was my land. I had nothing to fear here. As the hours passed, I found myself relaxing into the familiar rhythm of camping. I lit a fire, cooked a simple dinner, and leaned back in my chair, letting the crackling flames and cool night air wash over me. The sun had set completely by the time I heard the first sound. At first, it was faint, just a soft rustling in the distance. Probably a deer, I thought. But then the rustling grew louder, more deliberate. Footsteps. I froze, straining to hear. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was running through the woods. The footsteps moved quickly, circling my campsite before fading into the trees. I stood up, my heart pounding, and shined my flashlight into the darkness. There was nothing there, just the trees, standing silent and still. "Hello?" I called out, my voice wavering. No response. I told myself it was nothing, just some kids messing around or a neighbor taking a shortcut through my property. But the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. By the time I crawled into my tent, the fire had burned down to glowing embers. The forest was quiet again, save for the occasional chirp of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. I lay there, staring at the ceiling of my tent, willing myself to sleep. But every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves outside set my nerves on edge. Then I heard it, a soft, scraping sound, just outside the tent. I held my breath, my heart thundering in my chest. The sound grew louder, more deliberate, a knife slicing through fabric. I turned my head slowly, my eyes locked on the source of the noise. A small slit appeared in the side of the tent, and through it, I saw a face. It was shadowed and distorted, but the eyes were unmistakable, cold, unblinking, and fixed on me. For a moment, I couldn't move. Fear had rooted me to the spot. Then, instinct took over. I screamed, kicking at the tent wall, and bolted out the other side. The cold night air hit me like a slap as I sprinted through the woods, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. Behind me, I heard the crunch of footsteps, quick, heavy, and too close for comfort. "Leave me alone," I yelled, my voice cracking with panic. The footsteps slowed, then stopped. I turned briefly, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. For a moment, we stared at each other, the silence between us heavy and oppressive. Then, without a sound, the figure turned and melted into the trees. I didn't stop running until I reached my house. Once inside, I locked every door and window, double-checking each one. Only then did I allow myself to collapse onto the couch, my entire body trembling with adrenaline. From the safety of my living room, I stared out the back window, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. At first, there was nothing. But then, just beyond the edge of the porch light, I saw it. The figure stood motionless, half hidden by the shadows. They were watching me. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my voice shaking as I explained the situation. When the police arrived, they searched the woods but found no trace of the intruder. No footprints. No belongings. Nothing. It was as if they had never been there. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I stepped outside, every time I glanced out a window, I expected to see the figure standing there, just beyond the tree line. The realization that they knew where I lived was the most unsettling part. My backyard, once my refuge, now felt like a prison, filled with shadows that seemed to stretch too far. It's been years since that night, but the fear hasn't entirely faded. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside sends my heart racing. Have you ever felt like someone was watching you? What would you do if your safe place was no longer safe? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories might just inspire the next tale on Wolf Tells. If the safety of home can be shattered, where can you truly be safe? Our next story takes us deeper into the unknown, where an unwelcome guest reminds us that sometimes it's not the darkness we should fear, it's what hides within it. Story 3, An Unwelcome Guest, a chilling encounter in the wilderness. The woods offer a unique kind of solitude. The rustle of leaves, the crisp air, and the quiet create a retreat from the chaos of everyday life. But when that solitude is shattered by the presence of a stranger, it becomes something far darker. Tonight on Wolf Tells, we bring you a story about trust, fear, and survival, a tale that might make you think twice about camping alone. If you enjoy tales like this, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more terrifying stories. Let's dive into the haunting account of a camper who learned that not everyone in the woods is there to enjoy nature. The onset of winter always felt like a deadline to me, a last call for outdoor adventures before the cold became unbearable. I had circled the first weekend of December on my calendar as the perfect time for one last camping trip. The spot I chose was a remote clearing an hour north of home. It was one of those places that didn't see much traffic, just a flat patch of grass near a pond, surrounded by thick forest. I liked it that way. No crowds, no distractions, just the peaceful hum of nature. I arrived early in the morning, just after sunrise. The frost on the grass glistened in the golden light, and the pond reflected the bare trees like a mirror. The air was crisp, and every breath hung in the air like smoke. By mid-morning, I'd set up my tent on the edge of the clearing and built a small fire. I spent the early part of the day journaling, occasionally glancing at the pond, There was no one else around, and the quiet was comforting. But as the afternoon wore on, that comfort began to erode. It was late afternoon when I first saw him. He appeared suddenly, walking out of the trees on the far side of the clearing. He was a man, maybe in his late 40s, wearing a thick coat and a cloth wrapped around the lower half of his face. His backpack sagged against his back, almost flat as though it held nothing of significance. I froze, watching as he made his way toward the pond. At first, I thought he might just be passing through. But instead of continuing down the trail, he stopped at the water's edge. The man stood there for a long time, staring at the pond. He didn't move much, just shifted his weight occasionally, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. I tried to ignore him, focusing on the crackling fire and the faint sounds of the forest. But every time I glanced up, he was still there, standing like a statue. An hour passed. Then two. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the clearing. The air grew colder, and I added more wood to the fire. As I did, I felt his gaze shift. When I looked up, he was no longer staring at the pond. He was staring at me. The unease that had been simmering all afternoon boiled over as the man began walking toward my campsite. I tried to keep calm, though my hands trembled as I poked at the fire. He stopped on the other side of the flames, his face obscured by the cloth mask. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice gravelly and low. It wasn't really a question. Sure," I said, my voice wavering. He sat down without waiting for an invitation, folding his hands in his lap. For a long moment, we sat in silence, the fire crackling between us. "Cold night," he said finally, breaking the tension. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile. "You camp out here often?" he asked, his eyes fixed on me. "Sometimes," I lied. The conversation that followed was stilted and strange. His questions were innocuous on the surface, but something about the way he asked them put me on edge. "Didn't think it'd be this cold," he said, his tone almost conversational. "Yeah. It's colder up here," I replied. "Did you bring a tent?" "Nope," he said, his smile widening. "I like to keep things simple." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the clearing was swallowed by darkness. The firelight flickered, casting shadows that danced on the trees. The man's presence was suffocating. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I didn't want to seem panicked. Instead, I tried to keep the conversation going, hoping he would lose interest and leave. He didn't. After what felt like an eternity, I stood up, pretending to check on my gear. "Well, it's getting late," I said. "I think I'm gonna call it a night." The man didn't move. He just sat there, smiling at me through the flickering light. I turned away, pretending to busy myself with my tent. When I glanced back, he was gone. My relief was short-lived. As I packed up my gear, I felt a prickle of unease, like I was being watched. Grabbing my flashlight, I swept the beam across the tree line. The forest was still, the shadows deep and impenetrable. Then I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, half hidden behind a tree. His eyes glinted in the light as he watched me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. He didn't respond. My heart thundered in my chest as I threw the last of my gear into my bag. I knew I couldn't stay there. Not with him lurking in the shadows. The trail back to my car was a 2-hour hike through dense forest. Under normal circumstances, I enjoyed the walk. But that night, every step felt like a gamble. The flashlight beam bobbed in front of me as I hurried down the trail. My breath visible in the cold air. Every rustle of leaves. Every snap of a twig sent my heart racing. I stopped periodically, shining the light behind me, half expecting to see him standing there. Each time, the trail was empty, but the feeling of being followed never left. When I finally reached the trailhead, my car was the only vehicle in sight. Relief washed over me as I climbed inside and locked the doors. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing at the edge of the woods. There was no one there. For days after the trip, I couldn't shake the unease. The man had no gear, no supplies, and no reason to be there. What was he planning? Was he waiting for me to fall asleep? The thought haunted me. And I haven't camped alone since. Have you ever encountered someone in the woods who didn't seem to belong? Share your story in the comments below. As we've seen tonight, the wilderness is a place of both beauty and danger. Whether it's the shadow of a stranger across a pond, the terror of a knife slicing into your tent, or the unnerving presence of an uninvited guest, the woods remind us of how vulnerable we truly are. Would you camp alone after hearing these stories? Or are you already planning your next trip? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Wolf Tales for more chilling tales that keep you looking over your shoulder. Until next time, stay safe, stay vigilant, and remember, sometimes solitude comes at a price.